Hi, my name is Kelly Mannion with forgrief.com. I'm here with my friend today, Ashley Mori. Ashley is the Director of Grief and Loss Services with Every Step. Today, we're going to be talking about traumatic loss. And Ashley and I understand that the topics we're going to be covering today are very sensitive. And if today is not the day for you to watch, we understand. We will be here for you when you are ready. Ashley, tell me a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, so I have been doing grief, trauma, and mental health counseling work for over 15 years now. I've been in the nonprofit world for 16 years, and I've owned my own private practice as a licensed mental health counselor and certified alcohol and drug abuse counselor for the past 8 years on top of that. So definitely work a lot in the field.
What is your favorite part about your work?
I would say being there for people in their most vulnerable moments, when they have nobody else to turn to, being able to be a support.
And in your work, you deal with traumatic loss. Mm-hmm. Can you tell me exactly what is traumatic loss and how would you describe it?
Yeah, so traumatic loss can be defined by the nature of how someone dies. Like you could say that suicide, homicide, overdose, accidental injuries, you could just kind of define it and say those are all traumatic losses. However, at the same time, it's really individual. It's about how the person experiences that loss, because there's so many things that come along with any kind of loss. Traumatic losses could include, say that the media becomes involved or there's court proceedings. There could be medical questions and things that you have to be involved in, such as life support or organ donation. You may not find out the reason why your loved one died. They could be missing. Those are all really traumatic scenarios for individuals, as well as just not having known that that loss was coming. It was unpredictable. It was sudden. It's often perceived to have some suffering of the person who died, whether that was a mental or physical suffering. Just really like unjust or unfair, just and unexpected. And so that's really kind of what the experience that a person has, as well as the nature of death, can really be how you describe it. You could also describe traumatic loss based on how individuals, what kind of coping skills they have, how much trauma they've been through before, as well as just like how they regulate their emotions, all that kind of stuff. Because what could be, two people could lose someone to suicide and they would experience it differently. And that might be based on how they're able to cope or who's in their support system and what they've experienced prior in their life. So it's really important to note that just because it might be considered traumatic to someone, it might not be experienced that way to another.
Why is it important to understand if or when you might be experiencing grief associated with a traumatic loss?
Sure. So grief from traumatic loss can be incredibly distressing and can cause a great amount of anxiety, even depression. It doesn't necessarily mean that it will, but because trauma is so distressing, it can lead to anxiety more often than if you're experiencing a loss that doesn't have trauma with that. The other important reason to know that you are being impacted by a traumatic loss is because the loss is twofold. You're going to be experiencing the loss of that individual, and you're going to be grieving your loved one. And then in addition to that, you've also got this trauma that you've either experienced, been there for, heard about, and been through in some capacity that you have to cope with. And you have to kind of process as well. And so you've got two things that you're tackling, and they definitely overlap, and they also can be separate. And so you need to be able to recognize that you're experiencing it as traumatic, because sometimes they will overlap fused together. You can kind of get stuck in that if you're not able to say, this is really trauma, the trauma that I'm experiencing and I need to process through. Well, this is the day-to-day grief that I'm going through. That can take a lot of time to be able to process through both of those things, and sometimes together and sometimes separate. So, and that can also lead to really a lot of not so great feelings like that anxiety and that distress that we were talking about. So,
in your work, I'm sure that you see trauma take so many forms. Are there any universal characteristics?
Yeah, so that can be a really hard question. And I'll kind of answer that maybe twofold. Yes, there are definitely a couple of universal characteristics, and one of them is vulnerability. I mean, when you're experiencing trauma, there's an immense amount of vulnerability that you're going through. And what I mean by that is that there's a lot of individuals that maybe haven't experienced adversity in their life, or they haven't had experienced trauma in any capacity. And those people tend to view the world maybe as like predictable or safe, fair, like just. And then when you go through adversity and when you go through trauma, you tend to realize that maybe the world isn't as predictable as you thought it was, and safety is completely out of the question for you, and you lose trust for others, and things just aren't safe and they aren't fair. And so really, when you go through trauma, a universal experience is that it kind of shatters your worldview. But one of the reasons why it's hard to say, what are the other universal characteristics that come with trauma, it's so dependent on a person's individual experience, again, kind of like we were just talking about earlier, because how old were they when the loss happened? What's their developmental stage? What's their support system? What was the larger social reaction to the loss? What was their perceived attachment to that person, the dependence on? But overall, I would say that it is really kind of that different lens that you have and that you look at.
Ashley, as a bereaved person, how might I experience traumatic loss? How might I know that this type of loss is affecting me?
Yeah, so definitely when we experience traumatic loss, it comes with a lot of distressing, not so fun emotions, and they are completely overwhelming. And so our brain does really powerful things. It wants us to not feel pain. And so one of a really common response is to kind of try to avoid and numb. Because when you experience that traumatic loss, every area of your life is impacted. And so to be able to say, I just don't want to think about that. I want to avoid things, people, places that remind me of that loss, that remind me of what happened. I want to maybe cope in an unhealthy way. Maybe it's alcohol or drugs or something that helps me to numb that feeling. So avoidance and numbing can be one thing that you might notice that you're being impacted by traumatic loss. But another really common thing that you might experience is intrusive thoughts. And that is just like ruminations and thoughts of thinking like, why did this happen? Could I have prevented it? Did they suffer? Is there something I could have done or said? And sometimes people will ask, what's the purpose of this? Like, what is the meaning of this? Other people don't necessarily have that experience. They're just angry. There is no meaning. But all in all, you have a ton of questions about why them, why me? And those are thoughts that you just kind of spiral on and think about and really end up in a place where it's senseless and you can feel really helpless. And so sometimes they hit us at the worst times, which is that nighttime when you're alone, in the morning, and you just kind of have those thoughts over and over again, which leads to, trying to avoid that and maybe not deal with that as much. It also can lead to some just like increased physical and emotional symptoms, like that's when the anxiety can come in more often. You can really be more irritable and angry. It can kind of turn into like somatic symptoms, like those physical symptoms where you end up having like, my stomach hurts, I have a headache. With grief in general, you're always going to have difficulty sleeping, but it can definitely get worse. You can, not have an appetite, all those kinds of like physical symptoms that come up with that. In addition to that, you can really also experience a lot of like guilt and blame
Do you have any advice for anyone based on the last piece that you said where someone may make you feel that way? Do you have any advice that you give to the people you serve when that happens?
Yeah, I think that when people go through the grieving process, they really learn who's in their corner and who's in their support system. People are going to respond to you in ways that you maybe didn't expect, and that can be good or bad. And so it's really about boundaries, and it's really about being okay with that wasn't something that made me feel great. That isn't the kind of support that I need right now. I don't necessarily agree with what they're saying. It didn't make me feel good. And so it's okay to say, I need some space, or it's okay to even, take that boundary even further and say, I don't think that person is best to have in my life at this point in time. They're not the support that I needed. And then you might find other people that are responding in ways that you didn't expect or showing up in ways that you didn't expect. And it's okay to say, like, I need you more than I have ever kind of needed you previously. And
it sounds like you give them permission to either ask for more of what they need and less of what they don't. And sometimes people just need to hear that from someone else. If they're thinking about it, they need someone to say to them, it's okay.
Yeah, especially because if you're already experiencing that guilt and then you have someone come along and you're like, well, they were support for me for a really long time and they were my best friend for however long, or whatever the situation is, it can be really hard to set those boundaries or let that person go, but just kind of not have them in your life as often as you did. And you might feel guilty about that then too. So it's about putting yourself first and your needs first and your grief first.
Ashley, when you're working with one of your clients and you've given them permission to find a support network that works for them, what does that look like?
Yeah, so often, again, it's individual. That'll probably be my answer for a lot of these questions. But having a peer-to-peer connection throughout the grief process is so powerful. To be able to meet with someone who, again, they may not be experiencing their loss the exact same way, but they are going through it right there with you, is a connection that you really can't replicate within your own support system. They're going through the loss as well, but not in the same capacity. And being able to meet someone that you don't know and walk into a room where you've got 10 to 12 other people that are all nodding their heads in an agreement and feel like what they're saying resonates with you. It's just, you really can't replicate that. And so that's something that we really encourage, is to be able to go to support groups and to be able to kind of get outside your comfort zone and meet people that you haven't met before, because you find those connections in really unexpected places. And we also recognize that maybe groups aren't for everyone. And so it is more individual supports. And that's where, if you don't feel like you have that support system, or you're really setting those boundaries within the current support system, maybe it is time to find an individual therapist, a mental health therapist that can help you and really meet you where you're at. So those would be the two recommendations that we would make.
So let's flip that. And what if I am a person who wants to support someone in my life who has experienced a traumatic loss? How do I show up for them?
Yeah. So the most important thing to realize is that everybody is going to tap into resiliency at a different time. Some people don't really have the capacity to access resiliency, and they need to learn coping skills, and they need to get to that point where they can be more resilient. So having that expectation that your person is going to go back to who they were before the loss occurred, I just want things back to normal, that won't ever happen. So not going into the relationship with that expectation is a big part of that, and recognizing that resiliency looks different amongst everyone. And that the other thing that will look really different is that some people might really, really struggle, and they might end up on a trajectory towards more struggles with mental health, like depression, anxiety, those kinds of things. But not everyone does, and it's not your job as the person that's supporting them to diagnose them or to say, okay, this is really an issue. It's just your job to show up and to be there and walk alongside them, kind of companion them through the grieving process, and say, be consistent and say, I'm gonna be here for you in whatever way that you need me. I'm here to listen. That's huge. Talk about their loved one. bring up their loved one's name, allow them to have space to talk about not only their loved one, but they need to talk about the way that they died or how those things occurred, their experience in that loss. Give space for that too. If they tell you that they don't want you around and they want to be alone, then be able to say, that's okay. I'm going to give you the space that you need, but I'm still here, and still check in on them, still let them know that you're there.
So let's break it down to brass tacks. If you wanted to support and you desire to support someone who's experienced a traumatic loss, do's and don'ts.
Sure. Yeah. So, I mean, one of the main things I would say is don't have an expectation of a timeline. Don't have an expectation that it's been a year and they need to be better by now. They need to not be experiencing the grief to such an extent that they still are. Having expectations for them creates expectations for them that they don't know how this process is going to go, and they just need to be able to walk their own journey. Don't avoid them. Don't avoid the topic of or how they died, how their loved one died, or the circumstances surrounding it. Make sure that you're, again, kind of allowing them time to talk about things separately and together, making sure that you bring up their loved one and saying you can talk about them and things that you love and miss, because there is so much grief because there's so much love. And so being able to bring that into the conversations, making sure that you're not comparing your experiences and your hardships to theirs and trying to say, oh, I know how you feel because I went through this, or when my significant other died, this is what happened with me, because they're not comparable.
Does traumatic loss require a different kind of support than, say, someone who is grieving the death of a loved one in a way that isn't seen as traumatic?
Yeah, I mean, I think that traumatic loss is, again, by definition, it belongs to the beholder. And so as long as somebody experiences a death as traumatic to them, then it can definitely take some more time for healing to occur. And society kind of has an expectation that you're going to go through this, and I hate the word normal, but kind of like a trajectory of grief that is, I'm so sorry for your loss, and you're going to kind of maybe withdraw for a bit of time and grieve that loss, but eventually over a period of time, you're going to kind of re-engage in society and with relationships and in your work and all of those kinds of areas of your life. Whereas that's not necessarily true, especially with traumatic loss, because that trajectory can be much more difficult, as we've discussed with some of those, all of the layers that come with trauma that you really have to process through. And so it can be a much longer process, and that is sometimes frustrating and hard for people to show up and through the grieving process for such a long period of time.
Sometimes traumatic loss might have stigma attached to it, whether it's a drug overdose or criminal activities. If I'm a person grieving that type of traumatic loss, what are some of the things I might face?
Yeah, so the legacy of the person who died shifts and changes when there's stigma attached to it, and then the person who's grieving also can and very much does have a different experience when they're grieving. Just to give some examples of stigmatized loss, I would say that suicide is one of the most prevalent stigmatized losses. There's also, culturally and time frames for things. If you guys remember, in the 80s, HIV and AIDS was a hugely stigmatized loss, that people didn't necessarily always share how their loved one died when that happened. There can be losses like homicide, gun violence. Also, like the drowning of a child can be very stigmatized. There can be a lot of blame and shame around that. And so oftentimes when you have stigmatized losses, the person who's grieving doesn't get to be able to acknowledge them in the same capacity. All of those, all of those experiences, all those ways that people respond, the broader social supports and or lack thereof, really impact how a griever can talk about their loved one and experience their loss. It can be a really, really challenging time when you have stigma associated with the death.
When it comes to stigma and death, and traumatic loss, when a family is writing an obituary, oftentimes the cause of death is included in the obituary, but it's not always included in the case of a stigmatized death.
Right.
What is your advice to families for that?
First and foremost, the advice is always going to be do what is most comfortable for you, because it might not be the fact that they're not the ones that are uncomfortable with the experience and the way that their loved one died. They just don't want to have to go through any further discomfort and struggles with a broader support system in the community by putting that out there. They don't want to have to, because with trauma, if you are sharing over and over again that your loved one died by suicide or homicide or gun violence, you're reliving that experience over and over again.
What are some things that I should know about traumatic loss that might make me help navigate the grief that's often associated with it?
I think the important part is to kind of go back to, and not normal, but maybe a healthy grief trajectory is one where you feel overwhelmed and feel like every part of your life is impacted. But again, over time, you do start to re-engage. You start to not only just focus on how it's impacting every area of your life and all those secondary losses that come from the primary loss of the person, but you also you start to recognize the need to reinvest in your life and to be able to just not only spend time with other people and connect with them, but to make meaning and be able to kind of just put one foot in front of another. So I think it's just really important to know that at first it's going to impact everything. And then over time, it will lighten. It's never going to go away. It's always going to be present, but it will lighten and feel a little less heavy. And if it's not, then that's really when we want to talk to someone about that and maybe get some more help.
And what are the steps for that? When you realize that, yes, you need to carry forward, that we're not going to get through this, we're not going to get over this, we are going to carry this. Yeah. But when it becomes so heavy that you recognize you need additional support, what are the first steps to be able to get that, to ask for help?
Yeah. So kind of just a little bit before asking for help too, or maybe in addition to, I would say that so many people take to Google, right? And they say, how do I just feel better? And how do I make this go away? And part of what you can do is routine and consistency and be able to, it seems so silly because it's just so difficult to do the things that I'm going to say, but over time, continuing to engage in some kind of self-care, whether it is watching 10 minutes of your favorite show, going on a walk, whatever it may be that makes you feel better. It used to maybe make you feel better and you don't know if it does anymore. Just trying those things out and trying to have space that's just yours to grieve, while also having space to do things that maybe bring you some small amount of joy. Making sure that you're resting, which is like getting good sleep is impossible with grief, but really trying to focus on that, getting good exercise and nutrition and all of that are all going to be things that you want to do in conjunction with reaching out for that help, because if you just kind of do more of the same, it'll be even more difficult. And then reaching out to someone, whether that's a mental health professional or those peer-to-peer support groups, what's really going to be important is making sure that you are finding someone who not only understands and is comfortable working with grief, but finding someone who understands and is comfortable working with trauma, because they are two different things. They overlap for sure. But the thing is that when someone experiences trauma, they're always going to have grief associated with that. But the reverse isn't necessarily true. Just because you lost someone and you have, and you're experiencing that grief, it doesn't mean that trauma came with that. So if you are experiencing traumatic loss, you want to find a provider that has experience and feels comfortable with both. And the other thing is, when you find a provider, you want to make sure that they're the right fit. And as a clinician myself, I mean, one of the things that I say to people when they come into my office is, I can't be for everyone. I mean, I would love to be, but I recognize that I can't be, and that's okay. I want to find people the right fit. And so trust your gut. If you don't feel comfortable, if you don't feel like this is the person that you can talk to about these incredibly vulnerable moments, then make sure you're saying something and you're finding someone who does feel like a good fit for you.
Are there some flags, good and bad, that you should look for when finding a therapist to help you?
I mean, I think the first thing to do is to make sure that they do have the experience in the areas that you are wanting to work with them on. And then when you get in there and it's conversation and you're kind of building that relationship, that you feel physically maybe calm in their presence,
safe,
and you feel that safety. And oftentimes when you've experienced trauma, safety is out the window. You don't even know what that is anymore. But you at least feel potential to have some trust in that relationship. You don't feel as hesitant as you were before you walked in the doors, maybe.
Where are some places that I can look to seek specialized care for traumatic loss?
Yeah, I think that it depends on what all you're going through. So say that you have started to cope in unhealthy ways. Maybe drugs and alcohol have come into the picture. Then you want to make sure that you're looking for a therapist that maybe also specializes in substance abuse. But in general, if you're feeling really overwhelmed and you're feeling like, I cannot do this by myself anymore, then there are some national hotlines that you're able to call out to, like 988 for national mental health support. You can also call the suicide hotline. They will, even if that's not something you're experiencing, they will connect you to mental health clinicians in your area. The forgrief.com website has a ton of resources that you can look through and be able to find someone in your area. And then psychologytoday.com is a platform that you can look up therapists based on your insurance and all sorts of filters to be able to help you figure out if that's the best fit for you and if they have availability.